Did you know Socrates was still alive? Did you realize that according to Socrates' own argument, if you're a historian of philosophy like I am, you have to understand and teach people that according to his own views, he's still alive? That's right. Socrates argues in his dialogue, the Phaedo, for the immortality of the soul. This is the first time in Western philosophy that you get a clear introduction of a very radical idea that the soul is immortal, which means not only that humans have a part of themselves that exists after death, but that part of themselves exists before death. And this is not often understood, that it goes in both directions. So in this episode of the Becoming Human Project, which is part of the Plato Project, where I'm bringing Plato's entire corpus, every dialogue he wrote, I'm going to be teaching to the public in a year. I'm bringing that to the world, and I want you to join me. So many people have already joined. You can join for just $10 a month. You get access to my introduction to philosophy, but you can also come on Sundays to discuss the dialogues in detail if you're interested. So today I'm going to discuss the Phaedo, which is this extraordinary, mystical, yet rigorously argumentative dialogue about the last moments of Socrates' life. His last day, he's in prison. He's about to drink the hemlock for his impiety. He was condemned by the state of Athens for being impious, a social, essentially revolutionary. And he discusses with his students the nature of life and death. And in this dialogue, he gives a very famous set of arguments for the idea that the soul is immortal. And most people are terrified by this idea, and so they can't really consider it honestly. There's essentially two groups in society who already think they know what they feel about this. People who believe that they're going to exist after death, and people who are convinced that they won't. But most of us are probably in between. We're not sure. In Socrates' own time, many people thought that the soul did not exist separate from the body, and that when the body died, that was it. Socrates responds to that argument, and he makes a very famous set of arguments for the immortality of the soul. A lot of scholars present these arguments as if they're not plausible. I think that's actually a very big mistake. What I want to do in this episode is I want to explain to you why Socrates believed he's still alive now. Just think about that. It's kind of an amazing thing. Regardless of whether we are going to agree with Socrates' arguments, if Socrates is right that he went to the underworld to be with good beings, his spirit is literally somehow still present. We've been talking about Socrates for 2,400 years. And in that very literal sense, his spirit is still present. And all of my work in the Plato Project is dedicated to Socrates and to Plato and to the ultimate values and vision, the gods as they thought of it, that they served, which is wisdom, justice, truth. And we don't have to agree on whether the soul is immortal to understand that the idea is very important. In the Indian tradition, for example, the idea of karma is taken for granted, that the actions that you undertake in this life have consequences, even if you don't see them in this life. Your soul will cycle through the wheel of reincarnation. Many people don't realize this is not a uniquely Eastern doctrine, but that it's actually a central doctrine in Plato's writings. So the Phaedo is the first time in the order of the corpus that depicts Socrates' last days that you get this very clear teaching. I can't give a full defense of the doctrine, and I'm not here to do that. I want to help you understand Socrates' argument. But I do want you to understand in this discussion 3 things that I hope will change your life forever. 1, whether you believe you will live forever or not, something does live forever. That's the first argument. Whether you believe you will live forever or not, something will live forever. 2, most of us cannot psychologically handle this fact, okay? So I'll discuss that. And then 3, I want to summarize one of the most interesting arguments that Socrates gives to defend the idea that the soul is immortal. And I want to explain to you a very powerful principle about how his argument connects to contemporary science. So let's start with this first radical claim, that even if you don't believe you're going to live forever, something will. What does that mean? Well, I want you to think about it this way. There's essentially only 2 major theories of the cosmos, of how the universe came into being and what it is. And I'm going to discuss this in more detail with the third argument I mentioned at the last part of this lecture. Now, the two arguments are basically a steady state or a cyclical theory, which is that the universe came into being and then sort of evaporated or fell apart due to heat death and then came into being again, collapsed again, or that it had a unique origin in time before which there was no universe. Now, the only people who believe that latter position are scientists who accept the Big Bang Theory and agree that it implies the universe as we know it could not have existed before the Big Bang, which is a certain significant segment of people in science. But there's increasingly debates about whether or not the Big Bang implies that there was something before it. Stephen Hawking argued that something comes from nothing, which is a very strange argument, and I'll discuss that in a moment. But the other argument is that most people who accept that the universe had an origin in time or an origin at all believes that even though the universe didn't always exist, something existed beyond the universe. People usually, I think, understandably call this God. So you have that view, or you have the steady state cyclical view, the idea that the universe in some sense, even if it's gone through endless cycles of birth and destruction, as you see, for example, in the Indian tradition, that this is how the universe works. These are fundamental debates in what we call cosmology. Now, cosmology is a core part of science, but it's originally part of the broader history of philosophy, and it means the doctrine of what the world is, how we think about the world, what the world or the universe is. So when I talk about the cosmos, I'm talking about the universe as a whole. And Socrates' arguments about the immortality of the soul, I suggest, have many layers that are esoteric or mystical. And I could show why this is the case, because the Phaedo is connected to very deep mystery traditions in Greece, things that were secret and that you weren't allowed to speak about. And so there's a lot of connections here also with the Pythagorean tradition, which not only gave us math as we know it, the idea of math as a kind of fundamental structuring force of reality, which of course we now know is true from the success of modern physics, but the Pythagoreans also had very esoteric mystical doctrines, including the idea of the soul being present in infinite incarnations until it can escape, perhaps, what you could call the wheel of incarnation. So the first idea then is that even if you don't think you will always exist, you probably certainly would have to agree that the universe has always existed and will always exist. And if you don't agree with that, then you will probably agree that something like what you might call God has always existed. Now, why do I say that you would think that? Well, it's obvious. The only alternative to those three positions, either there has been a God that existed before the universe and maybe after the universe, or the universe, which you could identify with God, like the great philosopher Spinoza did, or in some ways Aristotle, arguably, the universe in some form that maybe is always changing or renewing or repeating has always existed. Or you think that the universe has come into being once and just going to go out of being forever. Now, if you think that and you don't think that there's anything permanent, then here's your position. Nothing produced something. So that is, I think, the most irrational position a human being could possibly hold. One of the most ancient philosophical maxims in metaphysics is ex nihil, nihil fit, a Latin phrase that means from nothing, nothing will come. So that, I think, makes sense. And here's the idea. If you don't agree with that, then you believe in anything, no matter how irrational it is, because nothing is impossible if something can come from literally nothing. So if there was nothing in the world at all, there was nothing, we can't even imagine this, and then something happened, then there's no reason to believe that when the world went out of existence, something wouldn't happen again that would bring it into existence. So in point of fact, no one actually believes that there was never something that has always existed. If you claim the universe came into being from nothing, then what you're claiming means, even if the universe went out of being into nothing, it could come back into being, or a new universe could come into being from nothing. So here's a simple argument. Either nothing produces something, in which case the something becoming nothing is never an argument that something won't occur again, or something cannot come from nothing. In either case, if there is something at all, there cannot have been only eternally nothing. Because there is something now, which means there wasn't eternally nothing, and even if the something now goes out of existence, I guess it could pop back into being again. So I don't think it's rational to say that something comes from nothing. If you believe that, it's fine, but you still will have to agree that something basically has always existed. So that's the first point. It's a point about scientific cosmology. Even if you don't care about the individual soul or your life, and most of us today who don't believe that we're going to keep existing after death, we don't believe that because we don't want to. So let's be honest about that. If you're afraid of existing forever, you don't want that to be true. And Socrates thinks most people are not mentally prepared to think about issues about life and death. So that's a very important thing, to acknowledge your bias. Whatever your bias is, you should acknowledge it. My bias is I was terrified when I was young of the idea of what I thought was eternity or unending duration. And therefore also the mathematical infinite bothered me. And when the infinite was developed in the modern form in mathematics, particularly in the 19th century, for example, by Cantor, many people, not just mathematicians, but philosophers and theologians, basically thought it was a terrible idea, and they had all kinds of objections to it. Now, it's an absolutely accepted core part of, an essential part even, of modern mathematics, that there are, many forms of the infinite which play a very deep role. Now, I'm not a talented mathematician or physicist, so I'm not an expert on that, but you can look it up. There's many resources you can find online about it. So that's the first point, is even if you don't believe you will always exist, you almost certainly believe something has always and will always exist. That's a pretty deep thing to understand. Now, let's get to the second point. And let's think about this in a way that's different from what I mentioned. Let's think about it simply in terms of what we today believe. What is we? Who's, for example, I already mentioned many people today believe that the soul is immortal and that it's always existed. But let's talk about, say, in Western scientifically oriented societies. Many people in those societies also believe that the soul exists, at least after death. But interestingly, those same people, many Christians, for example, some Jews, they don't tend to think about what it means. Has the soul always existed? So you have this, basically the presence of the idea of eternity. Or I think these are different ideas, just so you know. Eternity and infinity are not the same, but for the purpose of the Phaedo, you could see them as related concepts that we're not going to make a sharp distinction of, because we're talking about a particular thing, the soul enduring forever. What we really want to understand is, why is Socrates' argument so difficult for us to treat fairly? And the answer is because basically everyone today, like I mentioned, in sort of contemporary scientifically influenced societies, has a hard time psychologically dealing with the implications of this argument. Even if you believe there'll be life after death, a lot of the people who believe that have not thought about the idea of life before they came into this world. Socrates argues that, as we'll see in the third part of this, I'll discuss the argument that basically the basic form of generation is from opposites, so that you go from life into death, and likewise things come from death into life. So this is a very fascinating argument. I think many people don't take it seriously, but they really should. It's actually quite obviously true in at least a certain limited sense. The issue is whether it's true in the way Socrates argues for it. But the fact, therefore, that even people who believe there'll be a life after death have not thought about necessarily a life before this life makes it psychologically challenging, for example, to many people in traditional religious communities. Now, if you're a kind of metaphysical atheist and you don't believe that you have any soul that will exist after the body, which some religious people also believe that, then of course this is psychologically very difficult to deal with. Not only will you exist forever after this life, in some form your existence has had a eternal form, or infinite form before this life. And I think it's dishonest when people do not acknowledge how much that may disturb them psychologically. As I mentioned, it was a challenge for me when I was young. I didn't understand it. I think I had a lot of people have a certain psychological reaction to these things that can be very challenging, and you have to be sensitive to yourself. If it's hard to think about, then maybe you should think about it differently. I would just say what Socrates is teaching is good from his standpoint. So if this doesn't seem good to you, the comforting news is you're not understanding what he's saying. And that is one of the things that comforted me. I eventually, through philosophy, came to a much better understanding of infinity and eternity, and that has helped me a great deal. I was raised in a religious context. I appreciated that, but it didn't provide certain distinctions that I then found, which I could then return to those things I was taught, think about them differently. So the psychological challenge of this is related to Socrates' own teaching in the dialogue. He believes most human beings are not capable, because they haven't practiced enough, of thinking about these things well. It's very clear in the Phaedo that you have to train in order to do the kind of philosophy that Socrates is doing that lets you die in a state of happiness and contentment. Socrates is not afraid of death. He dies with ease and happiness, and that's a very profound thing. So if you cannot honestly say, I could die in peace and ease and happiness with complete confidence about what's going to happen to me, then you cannot pretend that Socrates is not in some ways a superior figure to you. That's one of the things we just have to be humble about as readers. Socrates is a remarkable person. Now, you might say, well, there's all kinds of people who are confident about what's going to happen to them, and I don't think they're superior. That's fine. I think, however, if you read the dialogue, the Phaedo, and you don't think Socrates is superior, even if you don't know anything about where you have come from before this life, if that's the case, or what will happen after you, you may want to consider whether or not philosophy as a form of humility about your knowledge is something you've fully embraced yet. If you haven't, that's fine. But if you have, then when you see a person who has a much better understanding of arguments and their meaning in their lives than you do, it's wise to sort of acknowledge, hey, that person has a lot to teach me. And that's what I mean about Socrates being superior. Not that he's better than us, although I certainly think in many ways he'd be better than the person, that I've been. He is a 70-year-old man. Socrates understands things that I don't understand. And as a great philosopher, he seems to have a kind of courage that I think is very desirable. But the fact is, most of us have not partaken of a form of training that Socrates in this dialogue says you have to take part in, and that is training for death. Socrates says that philosophy is the practice of dying before you die. And here's one of the specific passages. He says, so philosophy is an art of purification. This is a spiritual or religious idea in ancient Greece, common in all societies that have an idea of sin or impurification. And this was normal amongst the Greek world at Socrates' time. He says, does purification not turn out to be what we mentioned in our argument some time ago, namely to separate the soul as far as possible from the body and to accustom it to gather itself and collect itself out of every part of the body and to dwell by itself as far as it can, both now and in the future, free as it were from the bonds of the body. Now, this is a very profound passage. It talks about the body as a kind of prison, and that has had many meanings. It's led to ascetic traditions, ascetic from a Greek word for rigorous exercise, in which the body has been condemned, and you could see how that could come from this dialogue. I don't think it's ultimately what Socrates has exactly in mind, but it's literally does seem like what he's saying. But there's a deeper doctrine that I think is closer to what Socrates is telling us, and that's connected, for example, to the movie The Matrix. In the movie The Matrix, there's two different bodies, if you know it. There's the body you think you have, which absolutely is a problem, and there's the body that you actually have, which you don't understand until you've been liberated from the bonds of the first body. So unless you know what the Matrix is, as Morpheus says, unfortunately no one can explain it to you. So if you haven't seen the Matrix, if you don't understand it and appreciate it, that's fine, but it's okay. It means you don't understand this doctrine of the double body. But in the ancient mystery traditions, let me suggest to you that what we think of as the body was the most profound mystery. And in my own philosophy, I think the body is the great mystery that we have to understand as modern people. The soul is important, but ultimately the soul is pointing us to the mystery of the body. So Socrates says the practice of philosophy is a purification where you have to separate two different things. The most real thing, which is the principle of what's alive in you, from the principle of what's dead in you, or what isn't alive. Your body is alive because something living is animating it. You don't have to believe that force will live after you die, but you obviously believe it exists. Because when a person physically dies, something stops or changes in them. And that stopping or changing is the life force. Literally, the breath stops, but something in some sense separates from the body. Socrates' teaching is very spiritual and esoteric, and it has to do with, I would say, physical meditation practices that can transform your cognitive and emotional and physical practices. And the way I think of philosophy is you do have many different bodies that ultimately have to be understood in an integrated way. But you have your physical body, and most people do not know what their physical body is. They have an image of it based on pictures of the front of it. But because of the nature of being a human, you can't see your whole body in conspectus at 360 degrees. And a person who is obsessed with looking at their body from every angle would be, I think, a pretty interesting, perhaps odd kind of person. So our image of our body is not the same thing as our body. We have the image of the body, which is at the front of the body, particularly the face. And that's constructed by how people react to us. Basically, is my body good looking? Is it not good looking? Do I like my body? Do I not like my body? That's essentially a psychological relationship to ourselves, mediated through an image of our physical body in our minds or on our phones or from other people's behavior and reaction towards us. That's already part of being imprisoned by the body, because that body is not real. Most people's relationship to their body is not a living relationship to the entirety of your physical self. Unless you're a great meditator or a great athlete, most people do not have a relationship with their entire body. So I'm not going to get into this now, but it's something I teach as a philosopher, particularly with more advanced students. There are practices that Socrates is describing and alluding to that are essentially like what I would say the yoga of the Platonic tradition. And you have to learn these practices. You have to actually become capable of feeling the force of life in every part of your body. I would argue this has direct analogies to the text written 1,500 years after this by Patanjali, his famous Yoga Sutras. So there is a yoga connected with Platonic philosophy that is being introduced here. And if you haven't undertaken that yoga, if you haven't undertaken the purification process of dying before you die, of separating the life force energy in you from the thing that it is animating, then Socrates believes you won't really be able to easily understand his arguments. So you don't have to agree with that, but he would then expect you not to. He would just ask, have you been purified? And if you haven't, then of course you're going to disagree. And I want to point something out, which is you can estimate accurately what many people will believe about so-called philosophical arguments by just knowing their physical condition. If that sounds strange, it's not. I could definitely illustrate it. But basically, people have very strong associations between the parts of their body that they can access and the kind of mental states that are comfortable to them. I'm very physicalistically oriented. I don't think our body is the only thing that exists, but I think that to think of the soul as separate from the body is basically a mistake. And you could say, do I disagree with Socrates? I don't think so, but that's a complex conversation. So now let's close this out by getting to one of the core arguments Socrates makes. And I want to read you a brief summary of that because it's quite interesting, and then I'll see what you think about it. Socrates' argument is basically that everything comes from an opposite state that is generated. So if something dies, he argues that it may go into life because something comes into life from being dead. Now that sounds very strange, so let me just give you a basic form of the argument. He says, doesn't the weaker come from the stronger and the stronger from the weaker? That's obviously true. And this, you could say, is an argument about comparative opposites. We talk about someone getting weaker. They were getting weaker from a state in which they were stronger. That is self-evidently true. Socrates uses this to make a broader argument, and people will say, well, that's fallacious. Complicated issue, but let's think about a couple steps of this argument. Consider the fact that a child is, relative to the maturation cycle of a human being, the opposite of of an adult, right? And so you could say, let's test Socrates' argument out. Does a child come from a child, or does it come from its opposite, the adult? And the answer would be it comes from the adult. A child comes from the womb of an adult female. So that means that the child, so far, you could think of as the opposite of the adult, does indeed come from the opposite from the adult. Likewise, we can ask, does the adult come from the adult, or does an adult come from the state of being a child, the opposite of an adult? Answer, clearly, yeah, it's true. Adults come from being children. So what Socrates says is very strange sounding, yet if you think about it, it's true. If you think about life and you think about a plant, it's generating energy from the soil. If the plant dies, its death leads to a form of energy transformation in which it's gathered back into the earth through a variety of living processes that then create new life out of it. So Socrates' argument in terms of like nature seems basically plausible. In nature, things that die do go back into different forms of life. Now, you could say not the same thing. That's true. But Socrates' point is this principle generally true? Now, notice, let's go back to the first argument I made about something probably certain that you would believe always existing, even if you don't believe you will always exist. Does that make sense? Yeah, of course. Even the person who thinks that something came from nothing is agreeing to Socrates' argument. If you believe that there was nothing at all, and then somehow the entire universe came into being that we have, then you believe that the universe came from its opposite, the non-universe, the nothing. So if you think of something and nothing as opposites, and you believe what I think is a crazy idea, that something can come from nothing in that absolute sense, then you believe Socrates' principle is right. And if you believe something can come from nothing, then you definitely believe that dead people could come back into living forms, because there's no reason they couldn't. If when you die, you become nothing, and something can come from nothing, and you're alive now, and that means you came from nothing, then you could come back. So in point of fact, Socrates' argument, which can initially seem, I don't know why we react this way, but if you're like me, you read it and you're like, what? Does this really make sense? Actually, just think through the argument on any set of issues, and you'll find there's a very wide scope in which it's clearly valid, that things seem to come from, in some sense, their opposite condition. Now, not in every case, you could say, but what are the limits? That's the good question a philosopher has to ask. So this argument is actually quite plausible. So Socrates uses it to suggest that the souls in this world that are present to us as our animate bodies and our living personalities, that we've come from being in the underworld. We've come from a pre-existent state. So if you don't believe that, which is completely natural, you just think I came into existence when I was born. Interestingly, though, when did your consciousness come into existence? So think about this. Physically, you know where you came from, but you don't remember. Now, here's the question. When did your consciousness that you have of yourself come into being? Do you remember? I'm sure you don't. So did your consciousness come from consciousness? Were you always conscious of being alive? Of course not, unless you think your consciousness is eternal, in which case we're back to the first argument. So you don't remember when or how your consciousness came into being, but you know you're conscious now. So did your consciousness come from you being conscious, or did it come from unconsciousness? Well, look at a child. They are aware of you, but they're not conscious yet, that is, aware of themselves. And when they become conscious by a certain age, there's no memory of how that happens. So it turns out consciousness seems to come from unconsciousness. When you fall asleep, you become unconscious from being conscious. So you go from the state of consciousness to its opposite, unconsciousness in sleep. And then you go from the state of sleeping, where you're unconscious, that not in the waking state, to the state of waking. And Socrates, of course, famously, this has been used many times, Hamlet, others, compares death to sleeping. So we know we arise from sleep. We know, therefore, that unconsciousness and consciousness cycle, and that there must be something underlying the opposite cycling. I can't develop this here, but we're going to talk about it on the Sunday class on this for the Plato Project members. But Socrates' argument has to do with the metaphysical argument running concurrently with the surface claim about opposites, which is there must be something underlying all change from opposite states. And the argument ultimately is there is a principle that he calls the soul, psyche, which really means the source of all kinetic force, all motion, and what we think of as sentience or life. And these are deeply connected ideas in ancient Greece, and I would argue even in modern science, we're starting to realize this is the case. I'm part of a project about what life means in biology, and in my book I'm writing about science and religion and philosophy, I show how the idea of motion is deeply connected to the idea of life, and that whenever you have motion, you have one of the main precursors to what we understand to be the sign of a living organism. So organisms are much more complex forms of motion. There's self-organized and self-referenced forms of motion. But ultimately, when we try to explain where does motion come from, we are right back to the beginning of this episode about there has to have been something through which all the motion that we know came into being. So therefore, Socrates' argument about opposites, which seems so bizarre on the surface, turns out to have strangely a lot of plausibility. Just think about sleeping, think about consciousness, think about nature. There's some deep sense in which things do go from an opposite state into their opposite state. And if that's the case, Socrates says, then how do you know that when you die, you're not actually going into a state in which you'll be born into a different form of life? So that's as much as we can do here today, but I hope that it has really intrigued you. I hope it's led you to think more about the meaning of your own existence. You may be a far greater being than you have possibly ever thought it. You may be a far greater being. If Socrates is right, we all are part of some very great reality, which is much greater than we can currently fathom, but it's connected to mathematics. It's connected to the way in which nature seems to perpetually renew itself. It's connected to whatever the vital energy that we call life is, that we see and love so much as human beings, as animals, as plants. And it's connected to our love of wisdom, which is what philosophy is. Socrates thinks wisdom is what you have to train yourself to acquire in order to understand these mysteries. So I certainly don't think I've acquired that wisdom, but I'm pursuing it with my whole life. I'm seeking to overcome my ignorance and pursue greater wisdom. And I'm so happy that you are part of that journey with me today. I hope that you'll join the Becoming Human Project. Like this video, please share it with your friends. You can join again for $10 a month. I'm going to also be doing a special course on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Heidegger's lecture on the end of philosophy, Augustine's The City of God. If you want to join those, there's different tiers and you can get information about them. And I also consult and speak. So if you're interested in studying philosophy one-on-one with me, or having me speak to your corporation or business, or give you advice on things like fundamental values and how they relate to strategy, I'm happy to help as I can. I'm very busy, but I'm always open to inquiries, especially to speak about the things that I'm passionate about with like-minded businesses or nonprofits or individuals. So thank you so much. Again, I'm Samuel Lankar. I'm founder of the Becoming Human Project, here to bring philosophy as a way of life to everyone. I hope that whether you join the project formally or not, you'll continue to pursue wisdom, joy, and life, and that you'll have a very blessed weekend. Thank you.